On this episode of the College Football Podcast, I tier rank the Big 12, talk about some notable Week 4 matchups, go over some potential upset Game of the Year candidates, and I do a floor to ceiling ranking of the SEC. I'm going to start the show today by going over some games that I think could potentially be upset of the year contenders. So I'm going to rank them on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being no shot, and 10 being bet the mortgage payment on it. So I want to say, though, that predicting an upset game of the year, there's no skill involved with this. It's just a fun thing to talk about, it's a fun thing to think about. And I do want to point out that it always sounds crazy until you see it happen. Last year, after Notre Dame walked into College Station week 1 and beat Texas A&M, did you expect them to lose to Northern Illinois the very next week at home? I did not, but if you did, congratulations. I want to know, what rituals you're doing or where you're getting your information so I can bet on these things. But Vanderbilt over Alabama, did you see that coming last year? If I were to tell you the week of both of those games, let alone in like May, hey, this year Vanderbilt for the first time is going to beat number one, and it's going to be Alabama. If I were to tell you that Northern Illinois was going to beat Notre Dame, who just showed how good of a team they were, the eventual national. Let me rephrase that. If I were to tell you that Notre Dame will play for a national championship this year, but they will also lose to Northern Illinois, which one of those things would sound more crazy? It almost at this point feels like Northern Illinois. I don't know. Maybe I'm just saying that to try and prove my point. But point being that it's really, like I said, no skill involved, and it always sounds crazy until it happens. So week 1, what games do I think? So it's a little hard. I do want to say that this is the least likely, potential upset of the year contender that I see on the schedule. Um, it's week 1. It's hard. It's hard to come out in week 1 and not be ready to play your game. But Marshall at Georgia week 1, I have that on the scale of 0 to 10 as a 1. Just because if it was a 0, it wouldn't be on the list. But the reasoning, Georgia declining, we kind of saw this last year. The replacing quarterbacks are replacing offensive linemen, new receivers. They're the one of the worst teams in the country rushing the ball. So I think that they're taking a bit of a step back. They're declining. They're replacing pieces. That doesn't mean that they're going to fall and go 6-6. But, in the realm of possibility, if Marshall were to jump up and beat Georgia in week 1, it would be an upset of the year. That's for sure. It's not something that I really think is going to happen. It's, like I said, it's the lowest on the scale on this, in this segment. But if it were to happen, upset of the year. And I'm not just going to go randomly with these. There is some semblance of possibility in this list. That's just the least likely, like I said. Anyways, next, week 4, Sam Houston at Texas. So this is kind of a funny one. So a couple questions about Texas. There's another game later in the season that I also have as a potential upset of the year that involves Texas. But how will Texas handle the success is one of the big questions I have about them coming into this season. I think Sam Houston is a team they're going to give everything they have, and they're going to throw it at Texas, and that's how they're going to play that game. And it's going to be a team that Texas could easily overlook or just not be ready to play. Some crazy things happen. The ball bounces the other team's way. Arch has a bad game, throws some picks, whatever it is. But a big question I have, like I said, is how will they handle success, especially with this next generation of players coming in. So Steve Sarkisian has brought them back to relevancy. And I think that it's kind of something to think about that they've become relevant again. They've won a lot of games. They've had a couple of playoff appearances. They've gotten close. They played for the SEC. They won the Big 12 in their final season. But a lot of the players that are going to be starting for them this year were not starting for them. A lot of them were not even on the team a year or 2 years ago when this started. And like I said, a lot of them are starting for them for the first time. So how will the players that did not win those games and build the expectations that they currently have in Austin, handle them? How will this next generation handle the expectations built up by the previous generation? Now, there's a lot of staff continuity, that's when you have that, you have, ideally some they're in charge of the culture, they're bringing players in, they're raising them right, I'll say. But that's a big question, and I'll go over the next one here in a little bit. But that's Sam Houston game is in week 4. Another game, week 4. I think that this is the one that I have rated as the highest in likelihood, and I think Purdue at Notre Dame is a big upset game of the year contender. And did I say I have that as a 4 on the 4 scale, or not the 4 scale, the upset scale? I have that as a 4 from 0 to 10. It is in week 4, like I said. So Notre Dame, how do they replace the pieces that they lost? How do they replace their quarterback? Not that he threw the ball a lot, but how do they, shift into a new system with a new quarterback? Do they regress at all? They didn't play, a crazy tough schedule last year, but do they regress at all? Do they obviously they made it to the national championship. They did beat Georgia, so that was probably, that's the best prove it game you can have. That's the best win you can have on your schedule, is beating Georgia. However, it was a Georgia team that, you know, credit where it's due for Notre Dame, but it was a Georgia team. It was not your vintage Georgia. It was a Georgia team that had regressed. They were down a quarterback. They were, rolling into that game in the playoffs with, they were on their donuts, hubcaps falling off. They were kind of just falling apart there. So, they beat them. So, like I said, credit where it's due, but it's not like a vintage Georgia team. The Barry Odom effect, the new coach there at Purdue. How does Barry Odom, transition into that new role? How does he put that team together? How do they play? He's proven himself. He has experience coaching in the SEC. He was the head coach at Missouri. He was the DC at Arkansas. He led UNLV the last couple of seasons, and they did really well, especially last year. So whenever you have a coach that fits in a program, whenever it's the right hire, a good coach, oftentimes you'll see, in a situation like this, a Purdue who's classically looked at lately as, a nobody, for lack of a better term, they can come in and kind of jumpstart the engine, sort of like what Kurt Signetti did. I'm not saying that Purdue's going to win 10 games, but they could absolutely go out and beat Notre Dame week 4. They do have that in them. Notre Dame will have played a couple of tough games. They'll play Miami week 1. They've got A&M week 3 after a bye week in week 2. So, but I think that's the highest likelihood I have on my scale here. So, week 9, that's the next week that I see a potential upset of the year, and I got that it's Stanford at Miami. So on the scale, the upset scale, I've got it as a 3.5. Could we have a classic Cristobal game in this? If you don't know what that means, Mario Cristobal, especially in his time at Miami, has had a lot of games. They've lost games because of his coaching decisions, because of his game management, and Stanford, a team that I have is probably the worst team in that conference. I think they could. It's potentially possible that they could jump up and bite somebody, especially later in the year when Miami's, if they're in the thick of a conference race or whatever, they're kind of, maybe overlooking Stanford. And like I said, they have a bad game management wise from Cristobal. How is Carson Beck, coming back from injury there? We could end up being without a quarterback in Miami, depending on, he is healthy and everything, but how does he come back from that? Is he the same? Connor Wigman last year is an example I think back on whenever he got hurt the season prior and he came back, and it was just like a mental hurdle that he never got over coming back to play for A&M. He was all over the place with his accuracy. You could just tell that he wasn't easy in the position, in the role. Do we see something like that with Carson Beck? Does he maybe just have a bad game where one of those games where he throws a lot of picks? Because we've seen that, especially last year. So there's a lot of, variables when it comes to Miami, I think. But overall, they still should be a solid team. The last game that I have as a potential upset game of the year is in week 10. It's Vanderbilt at Texas. So take everything I said about Texas earlier, apply it to this game with the added threats of Diego Pavia and Vanderbilt, who took you to the wire last year and could easily do it again. I could see, this like I mean, they beat Alabama last year. Vanderbilt did. It's going to be harder for them to sneak under the radar this year. They're not going to be so focused on them, but they're not going to probably tend to let you slip through the cracks like they did. They don't just look at the schedule and say, oh, that's an easy win. They still will probably chalk that up as a win, but a win that we have to work for. So, but I do think that that's a potential big upset game of the year, especially coming down the final stretch of the season. So, if you have any comments on that, any thoughts or opinions, then feel free to let me know. If you have a list of your own upset of the year contenders, then send me a message on X and we can talk about that. Notable matchups week 4. This started as just notable out of conference matchups, but I kind of ran out of that currency pretty quick, so we're just going to move on to notable matchups. So this is week 4, like I said. One of the games I'm most excited about is Florida at Miami. And a lot of this has to do with kind of storylines, in and out of the season. So Florida at Miami. Florida has it sandwiched between LSU and Texas. They do have a bye before Texas, but it is sandwiched in those two opponents. It's a big game for Florida. They lost it last year in the Swamp. They will love to return the favor at Miami this year, I'm sure. Miami does play FSU after Florida. Some of the questions I have: Florida will have only played LSU as only as in notable opponents. So will they be undefeated, or will they be 2-2, whatever it is? Did Miami beat Notre Dame in week 1? How did Carson Beck look? Those are some things that we're going to be talking about and thinking about when this game rolls around. But the big thing is this game is going to be Florida playing LSU. They stand to gain a lot of momentum, a serious momentum if they win that game. Even if they lose that game, I think Florida could, if they were to walk in and win this game in Miami, they could kind of save that spiral that they would have there in Gainesville if they were to have lost to LSU. Meanwhile, Miami, if they played, like I said, how'd they play against Notre Dame? Kind of same thing there. If they, go out and lose to Notre Dame, this is a chance for them to kind of stop any spiraling in the fan base or, in the locker room and say, no, let's go. Let's turn around and, we'll beat Florida again just like we did last year. And again, back to Carson Beck, there's a lot of questions, not a lot of questions about him, but just there's been a lot of kind of off-field stuff that, we don't need to talk about, but a lot of, things that could be distracting him off the field since he's got to Miami. He, like I said earlier, he was injured. He's coming back from injury. So how's he adjusting? How's he adjusting to the new offense? How's he, mentally after the injury? Is he, just right back to how he was a couple seasons ago, or is he, better or worse than last year? It's a lot of things to think about. So moving on, Michigan at Nebraska. This is a notable week 4 game. It's the first conference game for both teams. So if you don't know, Sharon Moore, the head coach for Michigan, this will be one of the games he's suspended from, and he can't coach practice that week or attend the game. So he's gonna, have to trust his staff and do a lot of delegating that week and during that game. So that can do one of two things. It can, if you don't delegate properly, if you don't have a good staff and systems in place, then you can kind of spiral. Not just that week, but you can start a spiral and take several weeks to rein it in. It could be the start of a bad spiral, or we could see kind of what we saw a few years back whenever Jim Harbaugh got suspended, and it just galvanized the locker room and the fan base. And you remember the clips of Jerome Moore out there crying, cursing on national television about it. But so it can really go one way or the other. I don't really have any idea where it's going to go or any expectations. I think that he's kind of still been able to carry over the toughness that those players had under Harbaugh, but But the farther we get, we are removed, the more that program starts to take on his thumbprint and his personality. So we could see a completely different program, and kind of mindset and mental attitude this year. So a couple of questions: did Michigan beat Oklahoma? That'll be, you know, that'll be their out of conference game in week 2. I think it is. Nebraska should be undefeated. They will have only played, who is it? Cincinnati, Akron, and Houston Christian, it looks like. So they should be undefeated going into this game. Will it be 4 wins coming out of this game? If Nebraska comes out and goes 4-0, which they absolutely could, Michigan, I would expect them to start Bryce Underwood at quarterback, and, highly talented, highly paid recruit, but he is a first year starter in the Big Ten of all places, so it's not like it's just going to be a super simple step, but Nebraska absolutely could win this game and be 4-0, and that would get you really close to going to a bowl game for back-to-back seasons for the first time in a long time. So big opportunity there for Nebraska, big measuring stick game for them, and for potentially Michigan, but big one for Nebraska for sure. Texas Tech at Utah. It's another big game, first conference game for both of these teams. What's Utah going to do this year? Are they going to bounce back? That's a question I have around about them. They had a horrible first year in the Big 12, so the thing I'm interested in more so in this game though is Texas Tech and if they're legit or not. I have pretty high, I guess I'll say, expectations. I just think that Texas Tech has the potential to have a really special season this year. They're going all in. They're spending a ton of money in the portal. So this will be a good test for them to see if they're legit. Big measuring stick game in the Big 12. Texas Tech does play a pretty tough schedule though. After this game, they still have Kansas State, Oklahoma State, Arizona State, and BYU. Utah likewise also has Arizona State, BYU, and Kansas State. So big opportunity for both teams, but I'm most interested to see kind of how Texas Tech performs, I think. This week we also have the Washington at Washington State and Oregon State at Oregon games, but I won't go too far in on those, but those are some of the matchups I'm most looking forward to for week 4. Floor and ceiling. I'm also going to mix in some win-loss toss for this, but I'm going to go to the SEC. I'm not going to do the whole SEC. I've got 4 teams slated for this show. So the floor to ceiling, what it is, just go through the schedule real quick, do maybe a win-loss toss. What's the floor as far as your record goes? What's the ceiling? I'm going to start with Alabama. I expect a lot out of Alabama this year. I think they're going to be really good. I think that the transition they had last year was, kind of to be expected. I didn't think anyone, at least I didn't, it wasn't, expecting them to have a smooth transition. And, even if you're a highly funded, well-coordinated athletic department, any kind of transition like that, especially away from Nick Saban, is going to be a challenge. So when I look at their schedule, I see 8 wins right off the bat. So Florida State, UL Monroe, Wisconsin, Vandy, which, who knows, Missouri, Tennessee, South Carolina, and East Illinois. I think that puts your floor, if you're Alabama, at 8-4. Your tosses, I don't see any games that I can just write an L next to. I do see, like I said, 8 W's. As far as L's, I don't see any. I do see 4 tosses, though, in Georgia, LSU, Oklahoma, and Auburn. Georgia, Kirby Smart, he's always putting a good team out there on the field. LSU, I don't hear very many people that are down on LSU. Maybe I'm flat wrong. I'm not crazy down on them. I just don't think that they're going to be, a huge force to be reckoned with. I'll go into their schedule later, but I'm not going to get into it right this second. But I just don't think that they're going to be the, 2019 version of LSU or anything like that. Oklahoma, I'm kind of buying into the hype a little bit here. And Auburn, they're my biggest wild card team. They could go 4-8. They could go 10-2. Neither would surprise me. But for Alabama, I got your floor at 8-4. I've got your ceiling at 11-1. So anything in between wouldn't surprise me. It would surprise me a little bit if you went over or under either of those positions. Arkansas, you're up next. So Again, looking at the schedule, I see 3 W's. Let me say this. I don't hate Arkansas. I just think that with the way that they're treating basketball now and baseball, that football under the current staff just kind of seems to be not under the staff, but from the athletic department with that staff there, it just kind of seems to be an afterthought. They don't seem to be putting a ton into it. It seems like it's just on the back burner compared to basketball and baseball there. So I don't think that you're just destined for failure. I think that we just need a new staff there for football. But I see 3 wins on your schedule. Alabama A&M, Arkansas State, and Mississippi State are the 3 wins that I see. So I'm going to set your floor with that at 3-9. I see 6 losses. And again, you could you could jump up and bite a team here or there. But if I'm going through your schedule, if I'm putting in bets now, essentially, I would bet on these 6 games to be losses. And who knows? I lose bets all the time, so maybe I'm wrong. But the 6 losses, I've got Ole Miss, Notre Dame, Texas A&M, LSU, Texas, and Missouri. Ole Miss, they're probably going to regress a little from what they were last year, but they're still going to be really good. Notre Dame, I think that you're just out athleted by them. Texas A&M, you lose to them every year. LSU, they're going to be a much better team than you. Texas, I could see you upsetting them, but they're still, a much better team than Missouri. Same thing here. You lose to them all the time. 3 tosses. So Memphis, I didn't want to just write that up as a loss. I would lean loss on that, but I think they're going to be pretty good. That should be a pretty decent game. So that's a toss for me. Tennessee and Auburn. Again, Tennessee, they're not going to be, as good as they were last year. I don't expect, but they're going to be a tough out. Auburn, again, like I said, big wild card. So ceiling, I've got you at 6-6. Floor 3-9. So if you're an Arkansas fan listening to this, I think you're in for a tough year. But Sam Pittman there, I like him. I'm sure, I know everyone there does like him, but he needs to go, I think. Let me take a quick sip of water. Florida, you're up next. Florida. So everyone loves to talk about how tough their schedule is going to be there in Gainesville. If I'm going through, this is in, even though I wrote this in pen, this is all in pencil, by the way, so remember that. I see 5 wins on your schedule. Long Island University, South Florida, Mississippi State, Kentucky, and Florida State. I see, those as being 5. Feel confident, going to write a W next to it. Floor with that is 5-7 because I see 5 wins. I don't see any games there. I see a lot of tough ass games, but I don't see any sure losses because Florida is a really talented team with, I think, a pretty good staff. They're obviously, I'd say pretty good. Maybe that's just Florida propaganda coming out, but I don't think that they're terrible, even though the record hasn't indicated that. But like I said, I don't see any surefire losses. But I do see 7 tosses in LSU, Miami, Texas, Texas A&M, Georgia, Ole Miss, and Tennessee. The reason I put Georgia as a toss and not a loss, which it usually is because how hard and how well you played them last year with DJ Lagway in there. You probably would have won that game had he not gone down. Tennessee, probably not going to be so great. Ole Miss, did you beat them last year? I don't remember, but I think you did. So, not anything crazy there. Texas A&M, that's going to be a tough out, but you can definitely beat them, even though they, kind of swung a hammer on you last year in Gainesville. Texas, that was a pretty embarrassing game, but you were without your quarterback, so I think that'll be a good game this year. Miami, I think you can beat them. LSU, like I said earlier, I'm not super high on them. I'm not super low on them. I just think they'll be kind of mid, 8-4-ish. I don't know. We'll see. I have not done, I have not gone through their section yet. We'll do that. But Florida, I see your floor is 5-7. Ceiling is 9-3. Again, here, if you were to go over the ceiling, that would surprise me. If you were to go under on the floor, that would also surprise me. That's, kind of the nature of floor and ceiling. But Anything in between wouldn't be that crazy. I would be disappointed personally if you went like 6-6 again or something like that. 6 wins, 7 wins. If you did that, I would be a little disappointed. At this point, I just kind of honestly feel bad for Florida. They should be better than they are, and I expect them to do that this year. So moving on, wrapping up this segment. So I'm just going to do 4 teams today. On the next episode, I'll probably do another 4 or 5. We'll see. I'm going to wrap up here with LSU. So again, if I'm going through, if I'm writing W, L, T on your schedule, I see 6 W's, so 6 wins. You got LA Tech, Southeastern Louisiana, Vanderbilt, Arkansas, Western Kentucky, and South Carolina. I see those as wins on your schedule. I see 4 toss-up games in Florida, Ole Miss, Texas A&M, and Oklahoma. And I see 2 games that I would write an L next to, and that's week 1, unfortunately, at Clemson and Alabama. I think Clemson and Alabama are both going to be really good this year. Sucks for you that Clemson is in week 1 because the vibes after that game are going to be in the absolute dumpster. But I do see 6 wins, so I'm going to set your floor at 6-6. 4 tosses. I think that all of these games are winnable. Especially like A&M, you get them at home, you always beat them there. That series is just always the home team wins over the last nearly decade. So Oklahoma, I think like I said, I'm buying into the hype. Florida, I'm hopeful. Ole Miss, I think that's going to be a tough out. So all of those games are winnable, but they're all going to have to be worked for sure. So Clemson, I'm excited for that week 1 game. I don't want to say this because it's going to come off as, I don't know, biased, but I'm rooting for Clemson. I'll just say it. I'm rooting for Clemson in that game. I think the vibes around that program after that week is just going to be kind of funny to watch the meltdown. Not that I want you to do bad throughout the season or anything. It's just kind of fun to watch Twitter meltdowns from, the Barstool fan accounts and everything. It's always fun. But like I said, so going over it again, Bama 8-4 is the floor, ceiling is 11-1. Arkansas 3-9 is the floor, ceiling 6-6. Florida floor is 5-7, ceiling 9-3, and LSU floor is 6-6, ceiling is 10-2. So again, over or under any of those would be relatively surprising to me, especially LSU. If you were to go win 11 games, I'd be surprised and a little scared for the SEC, but if you go, if you went 6-6, that would surprise me. If you went 7-5 as LSU, that would surprise me. I would, say numerically, I would put your floor as 6-6, but in my head, it's probably more 8-4-ish. But that is what I have for those. And like I said, we'll go over some more teams on the next episode. Make sure to leave this a 5-star review if you're listening to a podcast. Like it on YouTube, subscribe. If you're on YouTube, follow the podcast feed if you're on podcast, and that way you won't miss an episode. All right, wrapping up this episode, I'm also wrapping up a segment that I started a couple weeks back, and that is tier ranking of conferences. We're going to finish up here with the Big 12. I've already done the Big 10, SEC, and ACC, obviously, just the Power 4 conferences. So, tier 1, again, let me start by saying, it's almost different conference to conference how you want to rank them, it seems. There's just so much, especially when you get into, the Big 12. There's just so much difference in resources and kind of the way that, just the way that they're balanced and whatnot. But with that being said, tier 1, I've got Arizona State. Obviously, you earned that last year. Big season for them. You return a lot. I think you're primed for another playoff run. I would probably predict Arizona State, Texas Tech conference title. That's what I'm really hoping to see. I think Arizona State, they're going to be, like I said, good this year. Texas Tech, I'm rooting for y'all this year just because I don't want to be wrong about you. So, also in Tier 1, Kansas State and Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State had a bad season last year. It's one of the, it's a bad season, one of the first ones they've really had there in a long time, but both of those are absolute, solid coaching staff, solid development programs going on at those places. I think that they've earned enough to be in Tier 1. If Oklahoma State has another bad season, I would probably, especially like last year, would probably knock them all the way down to Tier 3. But maybe tier 2. I don't know. It just depends on how things play out. But that's what I have in tier 1. Tier 2, Iowa State. I've got you in there. And by the way, again, to remind, none of these are in the tiers. Within the tiers, they're not in order. Like, it's not Iowa State is best in tier 2 or anything. In tier 1, it is probably Arizona State, but just they're not in any really order in the tiers. But I do have Iowa State in tier 2, BYU, solid year. I think you've done enough to shoot up to that level. You had a great, year there. You're moving a lot of, resources around. You're contributing a lot more to football. I think you're kind of there to, maybe there to be a force to be reckoned with for the future in the Big 12. Texas Tech, you're all in on this season. I've said that a lot. I have high expectations, a lot of talent coming in through the portal, a lot of NIL being spent. Like, teams are doing this now where, they've been smart enough to recognize their window and they go all in and they build up a roster to try and make a run. So Texas Tech is doing that this year in the Big 12, and I also got TCU there in tier 2. Tier 3, I've got Baylor. Solid mid team in the conference. You can't really overlook them, but they're, definitely beatable. Colorado, so Shador Sanders and Travis Hunter, obviously they're gone. They carried that team. Obviously there's, 22 guys out there playing to bring home the dub, but they carried that team for, a lot of games. If it wasn't for those two players, then they would not have done what they did. But it's a big show me year for Prime there in Boulder. I think that he's going to have to show that he can develop and recruit and put a team together outside of those two players. So West Virginia, I've also got you in tier 3. You got a lot of potential under Rich Rodriguez there, and I think that, we could see a surprise season out of them. Not like a 10-win season or anything, but maybe see them jump up and kind of beat expectations this year. Tier 4, I've got Kansas, Cincinnati, Houston, Utah, UCF, and Arizona. Kansas has just been bad. Cincinnati's not done much. Houston kind of seems like they're still adjusting to the Big 12. I do have a little bit higher hopes for them this year than I did last year. They got former 5-star quarterback Connor Wakeman coming in there. Utah, what the hell happened? That was kind of inexplicable. I expected them to do pretty well in the Big 12. It seemed like they actually fit there pretty good, but they had a horrible season. UCF, what's the Frost effect like back there? Scott Frost is back after his hiatus to Nebraska, so I think, just because he's done it before, in time, he'll probably get that program back up and running there in Central Florida. But for this season, I don't really expect too much out of him. And Arizona still kind of haven't, really recovered after the departure of your former head coach. But that was a quick little segment there. But that is the tiers of the Big 12. So make sure, if you've stuck around for this long, to leave a review on podcasts, subscribe on YouTube, and like the video. Follow me on socials. It's Campus Pigskin. But until then, I'll see you next time.